another Sheriff of Sodium video. I hadn't originally planned on doing this one, but since the start of interview season, I've gotten a lot of questions related to the residency interview. And let it not be said that I am not responsive to the needs of the community, or at least I try to be responsive to those needs when I think that the topic is both important and underexplored. And it was that last part that I initially had a hang up with, because how an applicant should approach the interview is not exactly an unexplored topic. There's no shortage of advice out there, which is the very reason why I didn't initially want to cover this. But it's absolutely an important topic. Don't believe me? Well, maybe you'll believe residency program directors, because here's what they said in their most recent NRMP program director survey. Now, the type here is a little small, so let me explain what you're looking at. This is a chart that shows different factors that a program director might use when deciding where to rank an applicant. The blue bars on the left show what percentage of programs said they use that factor, and the green bars on the right show how important program directors said that factor is. And although the NRMP's new graphic format is a little hard to make out, what I hope you notice is there's almost this separation in the data, where when you look at this, there are these 4 factors at the top that stand head and shoulders above everything else that a program might consider when ranking applicants. So I've got those 4 factors squared off in that big red box. And if you look at what those things are, the number 1 most commonly used metric to decide where to rank an applicant is interpersonal skills. And right behind that, the factor with the highest importance of all, at 4.8 out of 5, that's interactions with faculty during the interview or visit. And then right behind those 2 things, we've got feedback from current residents and interactions with house staff during the interview. So those 4 factors, they sit above the MSPE, class rank, clerkship grades, Gold Humanism Honor Society, AOA, you name it. And they're all things that get assessed on your interview day. Now let me show you something else. This is a graphic that I made to give you an idea about how programs winnow down applicants from the huge pile of applications they receive to the small number that end up matching there. Now, these are real numbers, again, taken from the NRMP's Program Director Survey, and the figures that I'm showing here are the average for all specialties aggregated together. So if you take all comers, all programs in all specialties, the average residency program has 9 spots that they're trying to fill, and they get 924 applications to do it with. And from that initial pile, they invite just 127 people, or 14%, to interview. Now, there's a few applicants who get invited to interview, but they actually decline, or they accept the offer and then they cancel, and it leaves the program with 113 applicants who complete the interview that they can consider when they're ranking applicants. And of those 113, 101 make the final rank order list. So that's 89% of that group. Now, there's 2 points that the discerning viewer is going to take away from this graphic. The first point is that the toughest gate to get through is the application to interview offer gate. I mean, look at that drop off from 924 to 127. Nearly 90% of applicants get lost there. But once you make it through that gate, nearly 90% of applicants who interview are going to get ranked. And like we just saw, all the factors that determine where you're going to be ranked are things that happen at the interview. And for the 10% of applicants who interview but end up not getting ranked, well, I hate to tell you, but we know with certainty that that happened because of something that you did on your interview day, because no program is going to waste their own time by interviewing applicants that they don't actually intend to rank. So in light of data like these, it blows me away that some applicants, after spending years of sweat and toil and tears and first aid and Anki and Q-banks and sucking up to attendings on the clerkships and feigning interest in research projects and gunning it up on your away rotations and jumping across every other burdensome and difficult hurdle in the residency application process, where you finally get to the point that your application gets pulled from the pile and you get invited to interview, well, it astounds me that these same smart and dedicated and hardworking applicants, they then devote only a tiny fraction of the energy and effort that they used to spend into making sure that they present themselves well at the interview. And then they end up blowing it. Your rank is determined on your interview day. So ultimately, that's why I decided to make this video. Now, much of what I'm about to say, many of you already know it and are doing it. But from having some of these conversations, I realized that some of you don't know these things, and I want you to be able to present the best version of yourself at your interview. So I'm going to give you my advice for how you should handle your residency interviews. But before I do that, let me just quickly say two things. First, as always, these are just my opinions. Your mileage may vary. Your mentors may disagree. I provide you no warranty. And actually, I can guarantee you only that my opinions are worth the same amount that you paid for them. Second, when I'm giving this advice, I'm assuming a certain strategic context. And that context is that your only goal is maximizing your likelihood of being ranked highly. And I think that's a reasonable assumption for many applicants. But some applicants, in some situations, they might reasonably choose different strategies that, instead of maximizing their shots on goal, they might be designed to maximize the goodness of fit with their program. And that's okay. And I'll highlight a couple of instances where that may be very relevant as I move through. But throughout this video, the advice I'm going to give, I'm going to be assuming that you're only interested in generating the greatest number of chances to match. So with that prelude, let's get into it. My first piece of advice, use a professional interview setup. Now let me tell you young folks something. Back in the olden times when applicants used to travel to attend interviews in person, there used to be a lot of advice about what you should wear and how you should sit or stand during a residency interview. And all this stuff was good advice because human beings are hardwired to evaluate another human being's physical presence. So if you go to your interview and you're wearing dirty shoes or a rumpled suit, or you're slouching in your chair, or you're not making good eye contact, or you're standing stoop-shouldered and slack-jawed when you're on the tour, it's going to change the impression that someone makes about you. But in our brave new world of virtual interviewing, most of that old advice isn't directly so useful anymore. But the general premise remains. When you meet someone, you're going to become subject to their initial hardwired System 1 thinking about you when they size you up. But now you have to make sure that you're giving people the right impression when you're across a Zoom screen. Now, when I tell you these things, I need to highlight my use of the word professional because that's an important word here, and I want to tell you why I chose that word. I've talked before on this channel about how residency programs aren't especially good at evaluating factors that actually lead to selecting better residents. And actually, if you're interested in that, the interview falls right into that category because for most programs, especially those that are using unstructured interviews, despite its importance in determining your final rank, it's really not very predictive of your future resident performance. But among other things that are not predictive, but nonetheless factor into that, program directors tend to evaluate physically attractive applicants more favorably. Now, I've talked about this here before, and there's a rich and consistent literature about this topic. For sake of example, I'm showing you here a paper that evaluated this effect in radiology applicants. And I chose this paper because it gives you a sense of the effect size that I'm talking about. Now, in this study, evaluators were only evaluating applicants' ARIS headshots. But if they evaluated an applicant as being facially attractive versus unattractive, that had more impact on their final rating than if the person was a member of AOA. It had the same effect as someone being in the top versus the third quartile of their class. Now, if an applicant was obese, their ranking also suffered, and it suffered about as much as it would have if that same person went from having average clerkship grades to being in the bottom tertile of their class. Now, there are a number of possible explanations for this finding, and none of them are especially flattering. I mean, are program directors really this prejudiced? Are they really just this thirsty? I mean, honestly, unconscious bias would probably be the most charitable explanation we've got, right? Before you answer, just let me show you one more thing. Here I've got a similar paper. This one came from the journal Surgery, but it's a similar study where evaluators were looking at ARIS photos. But in this one, the evaluators were asked to evaluate the photo on 3 specific dimensions. They had to evaluate the applicant's visual appearance, their attractiveness, and their perceived physical fitness, and then also their professionalism based on that photo. And what I want to highlight here are the odds ratios for being offered an interview. The highest point estimate of those three variables is for professionalism, which had an odds ratio of 2.69 versus 1.97 for appearance and 1.81 for fitness. So if you wanted to try to explain these data in a way that was more favorable to PDs than just concluding that they're lewd and randy horn dogs, then you might try to use data like these to say that what PDs are really trying to do, consciously or unconsciously, is they're assuming that a person who's meticulous and put together in their appearance at their interview, they might bring the same meticulous attentiveness to their work as a resident. Now, whether you believe that or not, you should believe this. At this point in the interview season, you can't do much to change your facial attractiveness or your BMI, but you can do things to present yourself as professionally as possible. And to the extent that this is the construct that program directors are responding to in these studies of attractiveness, I think you can expect that your candidacy will benefit. So here's what you're going to do. First, dress nicely. And here, what I really mean is dress conservatively or traditionally. Wear a jacket and tie. Don't wear sleeveless tops or uncover your shoulders. Do cover up any tattoos. Consider removing any unusual piercings. Again, remember the context that I'm assuming. From a strategic standpoint, I think you're far more likely to meet some grumpy, grouchy old attending from an older generation who gets put off by your modern appearance than you are to find some hip, young PD who gets a great first impression because they like your style. I mean, look, I'm not here to judge you or tell you how to dress. I'm just here trying to give you solid strategic advice. Next, choose the right camera angle. If you're using a laptop or an iPad to do your interviews, elevate it. Trust me, brother, no one wants to look up your nostrils. Next, invest in good equipment. Now, the default camera and microphone on most devices these days, honestly, is pretty good. But still, you need to check to see how you look and sound. If you look grainy or you sound crackly, go to Amazon and treat yourself to get some better equipment. And no matter how good your camera is, it won't matter a bit if your lighting is bad. You can get a couple of good ring lights on Amazon for the same price that you paid for your first aid. And at this stage of the game, I promise it will be just as good of an investment. Next, make sure you have reliable Wi-Fi. Please. If you don't, go to your school library or someplace that does. Next, use a thoughtful background. I think a real live background looks best, and a plain white wall is fine as long as your lighting and camera are good, which of course they will be because you already heard my advice about that. However, I have noticed this trend where these days some applicants like to stage their background with little props or conversation starters like you have a bookshelf and maybe there's a flower pot if you like to garden, or a couple of books that you've recently read, or a sports pennant or some travel souvenir. I think this can work as long as you A, don't overdo it and put so much crap in the frame that it starts to take away focus from you. And B, you choose tasteful items that you're prepared to discuss and that reflect authentically and positively on you if they do get discussed. Now, if the place where you're doing your interviews doesn't have a naturally picturesque or even a plain background, I think the Zoom green screen backgrounds are fine. As long as you don't choose a busy background, which again can be distracting. You want the star of the show to be you. Next, control the environment. You probably don't want your interviewer to see your messy open closet behind you, or your shirtless boyfriend staggering across the living room floor wearing just his boxer shorts and eating a bowl of cereal. You probably also don't want your interviewer to see the bong on your living room table, or your tin of Zins, or an empty beer bottle on the corner of your desk. Don't ask me how I know these things. Just take my advice that you probably don't want your interviewer to see them. Make eye contact. This was a cornerstone piece of advice for the in-person interview era, and it still is for virtual. But now there's the caveat that making eye contact on Zoom, it means looking directly into the camera, wherever your camera might be. So try to configure your screen and camera as best as you can, or just put a big Post-it note over your camera with a reminder to look here. Last, don't record the interview. Some applicants want to do this, or they choose to do this, but most programs tell you they don't want you to do that. And even if they don't, I doubt any program does. In some states where two-party consent is required for recording, doing this might actually be illegal. And even if it's not illegal, it's probably off-putting. I really don't think that reviewing your tape of an interview is going to help you improve your performance. And I just can't think of a plausible scenario in which you would later choose to use this video in some other way that wouldn't put you or your career in some jeopardy. I just really don't see an upside to doing this, and I wouldn't do it. All right, now that we've covered setup, let me move on to some advice for the interview itself. First piece of advice, do your homework. You know, in our modern era where many applicants still apply everywhere and just see what sticks, you honestly may not know that much about the program that you're applying to. And it is true that your interview day is your time for you to learn about the program. But please, before your interview day, you need to have at least a basic understanding of the structure of the program and what they're about so that you look like someone who's actually interested and not some random clown. But beyond that, I want you to do also at least a little bit of homework on your interviewers. Know who you're talking to. Almost all programs are going to tell you who you're going to be interviewing with in advance, and it is well worth a few minutes of your time to quickly look them up. You don't need to memorize their CV, but you do want to have some idea about who the person is and what they're about. I mean, are you talking to the chief resident or the department chair? Is this person a researcher? What's their research about? Are they a clinician? What's their subspecialty or area of interest or expertise? Different answers may steer you in different directions when you respond to their questions, and they certainly ought to guide you when you ask your own questions, which is a point that I'm going to come back to in a moment. But before I get there, I need to make a final, slightly more sophisticated point about this, which is, although I think you should always do a little bit of background about who you're interviewing with, it's not always a good idea to reveal to your interviewers that you've done this homework. That is a matter that requires judgment. If you're interviewing with a resident and you tell her that you know she's into hiking because you saw it on her Instagram page, she's justifiably going to be creeped out, and you can expect to be ranked accordingly. On the other hand, if you're interviewing with a full professor who's well known in the field, seizing an opportunity to point out that you read their paper on such and such, that could be an appropriate strategic comment, because the bigger the person is, or the bigger they think they are, the more they expect that people will know a little bit about them, and the more offended they may be if you don't. Next, don't be a rube. There are a handful of very common interview questions. You won't be asked them by every interviewer, but you will certainly be asked them by some, and if you act like you're just now thinking about it for the first time, you're going to look like an unsophisticated rube, and you're going to be ranked accordingly. So think about these things. Tell me about yourself. Why did you choose this specialty? Why are you interested in this program? What things are you even looking for in a program? What's your 10-year, or 15-year, or 20-year career plan? What do you like to do outside of medicine? Tell me about your most memorable patient. Tell me about your greatest achievement. Tell me about your biggest struggle. What's your biggest strength and your greatest weakness? If you're actually interested in matching, these questions simply cannot catch you off guard. Next, rehearse appropriately. Now, I just told you a few minutes ago that I'm always surprised how many applicants underprepare for their interview after working so hard for the first 3 years of medical school, given that when you make it to the interview stage, this is the most important thing. So you need to rehearse appropriately. But again, there's a key word here, and that word is appropriately. So let me tell you what I mean. There's a sweet spot for preparation and rehearsal, and that sweet spot differs somewhat from person to person. But by this point in your life, you ought to know what kind of person you are. If you're an extrovert who's comfortable thinking out loud, you don't need to rehearse your answers very much, and actually doing that would probably provide negative value, because then your answers to common questions like, why did you choose this specialty? They're going to come off as canned when you're saying the same thing word for the 15th time with your eyes glazed over and a little bit of drool hanging out the corner of your mouth. For someone like you, you really probably only need to do the little thought exercise that I'm going to describe in just a moment, and then you can think up good answers on the fly. Remember, this is a residency interview. You're not reading the nightly news. Even if you don't have perfect diction, you're going to come across well if your answers are reasonably thought out and they crackle with authenticity. On the other hand, if you're an introvert, if you shun the spotlight, if your face turns red on rounds, if you're not comfortable with public speaking, then to put your best foot forward, you really do need to rehearse. Now, I still don't want you to have canned answers. And for the love of Jesus, please do not print out answers to possible interview questions. Then take a long, silent pause as you shuffle them around on your desk when someone asks you a question, and then start reading off the appropriate page. This is not the look that you want to have. Don't ask me how I know this. It's okay to be quiet. Program directors get it. They know that many of the best residents don't necessarily shine on the spotlight of rounds, but they're thoughtful and caring and diligent, and they take good care of the patients. But in your interview, you want to show that you're a real person, not some non-playable character that the interviewer just stumbled upon. You don't want to come off as someone who has no thoughts, or someone who has thoughts but can't get them out of their head, or maybe they have thoughts or maybe they don't, but they can't interact with another human being in a structured social situation. Because if your interviewer concludes any one of those three things, it really raises serious questions about your ability to function on the job as a resident physician. And guess what? You'll be ranked accordingly. So, here's what I recommend that you do. Rehearse answers to the common questions. Practice them with your significant other or a classmate or your mom or dad or your mentor or your advisor, because then at least you won't be caught flat-footed on those questions. But the universe of possible interview questions is vast, and no matter how much time you waste sitting and looking at lists of common interview questions, you're going to get questions that you couldn't have anticipated. So the other thing that you need to do is spend some time in thought. And if you're good on your feet, like I said, this little exercise is probably the only thing that you need to do. So the first part of the exercise is you're going to spend some time in thought. And ideally, you're not just going to think, you're going to also write down what you've been thinking about to help solidify it. You're going to think about things like this. Think honestly about your time in medical school. What was hard? What was easy? What are you most proud of? Think about how you personally have changed. Think about the patients you've seen, and think about times where you did something that might have made a difference or helped someone. Think about a time where you learned something. Think about something that you could teach someone else. Think about a time when you were embarrassed or proud or scared. Think about a time when you were brought to tears. And the reason that I want you to think about all these things is that some of them might be interview questions directly, but even if they're not, spending some time in introspection is going to help you create this library of experiences that are at the top of your head if an interviewer asks an off-the-wall question. So instead of being caught completely off guard, you're going to have some potentially related thoughts that you've stewed on and are somewhat ready to share. So don't just stop thinking when you get to medical school. Think about residency. What are you excited about? What are you scared of? What do you think you're going to be good at? What do you think you're going to need some help with? Think about medicine in general. When are the times that you feel most energized when you're in the hospital? Who are the doctors that you most admire? What is it about them that makes you admire them? What do you hope your colleagues or your patients say about you? Again, not everything is going to come out in an interview, but I promise you some of it will. So I think it's like practicing for improv comedy or a freestyle rap battle, which are both things that I have zero experience or expertise with, but they seem like fitting analogies for the kind of spontaneous activity that would still benefit from having mentally rehearsed some of the potentially relevant components ahead of the big show. Let me introduce another piece of advice that's somewhat adjacent, which is put yourself in the interviewer's shoes. I mean, what is the interviewer after? They want to find good residents. So when they talk to you, that's the lens through which they're evaluating you. So before you have words that come out of your mouth, I want you to spend some time thinking about what makes a good resident. Because if you think about that ahead of time, it will also help you frame your thoughts in the most favorable light. And I know this might be a little bit more of a challenging exercise because you're not a program director and you haven't been a resident yet. So I'm going to give you a break from the questions, and instead I'm just going to go ahead and tell you some of the things that program directors care about. I'm going to present to you the profile of a good resident. A good resident loves patient care. Now, we have this hidden curriculum in academic medicine where institutions, of course, every institution says that they value patient care, but faculty at those institutions, when they see that the people who get promoted and patted on the head and rewarded are people who are doing research or writing papers or winning grants or getting a title because they were administering something, well, faculty see what's really valued. And that same principle, unfortunately, has trickled down to residency selection as well, where these days it's often not considered enough to be an academically solid applicant who wants to take care of patients. Many programs expect you to have some X factor with research or QI or policy or global health or community advocacy. And if you're applying to an elite program, or at least a program that fancies themselves as being elite, these things may be very impactful to your selection because those kind of programs view themselves as having a mission to create the next generation of physician scientists or academic medical leaders. But the vast majority of program directors, even when they work at such an institution, they understand that no matter what else you might do, you're going to spend the bulk of your time in residency taking care of patients. And a better resident is very happy doing that task. So if you can convey that that's something you want to do, your candidacy will benefit. A good resident is not an attrition risk. Remember, from the program standpoint, when a resident quits, the program's in a real bind, especially for smaller programs or surgical specialties. Programs want people who are committed. So a future doctorpreneur might look good on paper, but if that person quits the program to go work on their startup, the program's probably going to regret matching them. A good resident gets along with other people. No program director wants to spend their time refereeing little interpersonal conflicts among the residents. A good resident is a good teammate. They pitch in to help the team, to drive care forward for the patient, even if it's not, quote, their job, end quote. A good resident is thorough. A good resident is honest. A good resident can accept feedback. A good resident has agency, especially as it relates to their education. They want to learn, in part because they love the field and are sincerely curious about it, and in part because they want to provide good care. So they don't just sit around and wait for someone to tell them it's teaching time. They look things up and they read about it and they try to figure things out. A good resident wants to be trained. They understand that residency is inherently difficult, but they know also there's going to come a day in the not-so-distant future when patients trust and depend upon them to make the right decisions, and they want to be trained and prepared for that eventuality. I could keep going and going, but I think you're starting to get the idea. And what I hope you see also is that all these things are intangibles. They're not things that are easily assessed, or they're assessed only very indirectly by the data and documents that are in your ARIS application. And this is the very reason why the interview is so impactful for programs making rank order list decisions. This, when the program director is staring at you from the other side of the Zoom screen, this is how they're trying to size you up. And when you realize this, you can leverage it to your advantage. But you can only do that if you follow my next piece of advice, which is this: consider what you're communicating. Now, if you do that exercise that I gave you a few minutes ago and you think about all these things, you may have answers on the tip of your tongue that are honest answers, but if you let them pass out of your mouth without filtering them, you may be communicating something that's undesirable when you view those answers through the lens of what programs are looking for. Let me give you an example. You might get a question like this. Tell me about your ideal day off from work. How would you spend your time? What would you do? Now, an honest applicant might say something like, sleep, or get as far away from the hospital as possible. And if you say something like that, you might get a polite chuckle. But if you answer the question like that, you might also be conveying that you have low energy, or that you don't really like patient care or medicine all that much. So it would be better if you answered such a question by saying that you wanted to go hiking or Finish up this one book that you've been reading, or go out to dinner with your significant other, or whatever it is that you actually like to do that's a normal activity and can't be mistaken as evidence of a negative personality trait. That brings me to another point. Don't lose yourself. Let me go back to that same example about tell me your ideal day off from work. Now, somewhere out there might have been someone who, when we did that little exercise, they thought in their head, well, Dr. Carmody just said I should think about what program directors want to hear, so I'm going to say that I use my off day to read up on my patients, or do an extra shift, or help out with the extra case. And if you say something like that, my friend, you will have made a horrible mistake, because best case scenario, you're going to sound like a huge suck up, and worst case scenario, you're going to sound like a big phony, because it's not you. Unless you're like that applicant from the Dr. Glaucomflecken video about how to ace your neurosurgery interview, if you say something like that, it's going to come off as inauthentic. It's not you. So don't lose yourself. My advice here is not to say whatever you think program directors want to hear. My advice is to choose from the subset of authentic answers that might be bouncing around in your head, the authentic answer that best presents your candidacy to them. It puts you in the most flattering light. That's what you want to do. Now, one final piece of advice before I move on. It's not what you say, it's how you say it. There's lots of common interview questions that ask about something uncomfortable. Tell me about a time you made a mistake, or tell me about a time that you failed at something, or tell me a time you learned a lesson the hard way, or whatever. And when you answer, the content of your answer is honestly not that important. All right, hang on a second, and before I move on, I probably need to clarify that. You do need to choose an example of a struggle that's somewhat serious. I mean, please don't sit there and say that studying for USMLE Step 2 CK was your biggest struggle, but it paid off in the end because you got a 270. At the same time, don't make the mistake of confiding something so deep and serious that talking about it honestly is going to make people question your character. So what I guess I'm saying is that within some reasonably broad limits, the content of your answers don't matter. What matters is the way you say it. Because you could describe the same basic event, and you could talk about it in a way that makes you sound self-centered and immature, or in a way that provides evidence of introspection and growth and good character. Or actually, let me give you a concrete example. And here I'm going to give up one of my trade secrets, but it's in the service of the greater good, so here goes. One of my favorite interview questions is to ask about an applicant's medical school. Oh, I see you're from such and such College of Medicine. What's that like? And they say whatever they say, and then I say, what's the worst thing about going to school there? And it's not that I give a rip about what the worst thing about their medical school is, but asking this is a good test to see how easily an applicant gets into complaining. Some applicants, when you ask this question, they sort of struggle to answer because it's sort of a strange question. And some other applicants, they'll level some modest and fair criticism of their school. But some other applicants, once you've opened that door and invited them to do so, they'll start rapidly rattling off their school's failure. I mean, their whole countenance darkens and their body language shifts. Well, they aren't receptive to student feedback, and they don't give us enough research opportunities, and they make us take overnight call even though it's pointless, and they need to give us more dedicated study time before the exam and every clerkship. And it's not that any of those are unfair critiques. Many of them are completely legitimate concerns, but what these applicants are telling you is not some blueprint for how to improve their school's curriculum. They're telling you that they're gloomy habit complainers, which is a phenotype of residents that most residency programs seek very strongly to avoid. Again, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. Most residency interview questions don't have right answers, but there is one that absolutely does. And that's this one. Do you have any questions? The correct answer is yes. Why? Of course I have questions. And let me forewarn you, what questions do you have for me is probably the single most common residency question you'll be asked. In fact, many of you will encounter interviewers, if you haven't already, who will have next to zero knowledge of your application, but will nonetheless choose to start off their interview with you by asking you what questions you have for them. And some of you may be tempted to say that your questions have all been answered through some combination of careful research and investigation that you made before deciding to spend your hard-earned money to apply to that program, or that your questions were answered by the program director's highly informative PowerPoint that you watched just moments ago, or that your questions had been answered by the detailed discussions that you already had with previous interviewers, or at the resident happy hour when you went there the night before. But please do not say any of those things. If you were asked this question, the correct answer is yes. And the answer is yes because you are an applicant who is interested in maximizing your opportunities to match. And for such an applicant, their supply of questions is inexhaustible, because such an applicant realizes that by answering no, they might be conveying that they're just not that into the program, which is not how you maximize your shots on goal for the match. So even if your questions have already been answered, ask them again. Because let me tell you something, partner, nobody's going to fact check you on that. And honestly, it sometimes is highly informative to hear what different people have to say about the same topic. And even if it isn't, asking informed, serious-minded questions makes you look like the kind of applicant that programs want to rank. So really, this is a win-win. You just have to summon your effort and say yes. Now, having said that, there's a couple of finer points about asking questions that you ought to know. The first is have discretion. You want to have discretion about the kinds of questions you ask. Let me tell you what I mean. Don't ask how many residents are in the program. I mean, unless you want to seem like an uninterested dullard. You can get that from the website. Or similarly, it's good to know how far it is to get from the hospital to the airport or to some nearby city. But these are the kind of questions, honestly, that you should just ask Google. You don't ask your interviewer. Because if you spend your time asking questions like this, it's going to give you a negative expected value in your final ranking compared to if you'd ask questions about the clinical caseload or about research support resources. My point is, think about what your questions say about you. Many prospective residents are going to have questions about mental health resources or burnout or fatigue mitigation. But remember the context that I'm assuming here. If you ask those questions to certain interviewers, they may draw a different inference about you than if you'd asked about academic programs or fellowship readiness. The second thing you want to have discretion about is to whom you ask your questions. For instance, you absolutely need to know about call frequency and workload, but these are the kind of questions you ask privately to the residents, not to the department chair. Same principle applies to questions about leave or scheduling vacation or days off. These are important questions. But if you ask multiple questions about this, or if you ask the program director to get into a lot of granular detail on these topics, you're going to make them wonder what it is you're trying to get out of before you even get into the program. Tailor your questions to the expertise of the person you're talking to. If you're stuck, one of the best questions you can ask almost any interviewer is, how did you end up in this place? Why did they choose to work here? Oh, that's fascinating. Tell me more. Now, what do they like best about the hospital or the patients or the area? Oh, I see. People love to talk about themselves. Give them the chance. As a side note, before I move on, this is one of the most powerful techniques to manage a difficult interview where you just can't seem to connect with the person. Another good question that you can ask your interviewer is what career advice they give someone that's in your situation. That one always generates some interesting and thoughtful responses as well. But before I get too far off track, let me get back to some things that you should know about asking questions. Next, it's not what you ask, it's how you ask it. If you were alive 5 minutes ago, this will all sound familiar, and honestly the same logic applies, so I'm not going to say it again. It's always better to frame your questions by saying something like, I noticed your program does such and such. Could you tell me more about that? It's flattering to your interviewers, and it shows you've done your homework. Next, don't ask questions that lead to unhelpful responses. Now, like I said, if you have to ask a pointless question, do it. But really, these interviews are for you too, so you don't want to get so caught up in selling yourself that you miss out on an opportunity to get a feel for the program or to acquire the information that you really need. So try to ask good questions. Some questions are, I think, inherently unhelpful. Let me give you a quick example. There must be some list of questions going around that applicants are supposed to ask that includes a number of these, but here's one. Tell me what mentorship looks like in this program. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that question, except I don't think there's really any answer to it that could possibly have that much impact on where you're going to rank that program. So unless you have an answer that's going to be impactful for you, I really wouldn't ask questions like that. They're inherently unhelpful. If you've asked all your regular questions, you might ask about clinical support services, or how many rotations occur off-site, or whether the program pays for parking, or whether they pay for USMLE Step 3, or travel to conferences, or something that actually might have some greater chance of influencing how you're going to rank the program than wasting your time asking something like this. On the other hand, there are some questions that aren't inherently unhelpful, but sometimes applicants ask them in such a way that they're guaranteed to generate an unhelpful answer. Do residents at this program feel prepared for clinical practice? Yes. Are the faculty accessible? Why, yes. Yes, they are. Is the program leadership responsive to resident concerns? Oh, indeed. Does this institution value residents from diverse backgrounds? Most definitely. Is the area livable? Mm-hmm. The obvious problem with questions like these is that they're phrased in a way where there's a right answer, and 99% of interviewers are going to give you that right answer. So if this topic is important to you, you need to ask the question in a different way. Or maybe you open the conversation with that question, but then you follow up with questions that are more likely to give you some insight. And the key thing here is to get specifics. So instead of asking, are residents prepared for the boards, you should seek out information on what the program does to help residents prepare for the boards. Do they buy you a Q-Bank, or do they just tell you to read more? So don't ask, does the program support resident research? Ask, what were the most successful resident research projects? Don't ask if residents in the program are prepared for fellowship. Ask to see the match list. I could keep going, but you get the idea. Whatever it is that you care about, whatever it is that you actually want to learn about, your mantra when you're asking questions should be to get the interviewer to show, not tell. So you lead the conversation toward evidence and examples and away from empty platitudes. All right, on to another key piece of advice. Assume everyone is evaluating you, because they probably are. Or at the very least, they'll get the opportunity to share an evaluation of you if you do something that helps them form a very strong opinion of you one way or another. I think almost all applicants are streetwise enough to mind their P's and Q's when they're talking to the program director or the senior faculty, but some make the mistake of letting their guard down a little bit too much when they're around near peers like the residents who are already in the program. But remember that chart I showed you before from the NRMP Program Director's Survey? You remember the third and fourth most impactful factors of those four that are set above everything else were really resident input. So even when you're talking with the residents, even in casual settings, make sure you're presenting yourself thoughtfully and through the lens of authenticity and the lens of what residents are looking for in you. Don't act entitled, or name drop other programs that you're considering, or do anything that in any way suggests that you're overqualified to match into that program. And if you're listening to this and thinking, wow, who would do that? I will put it to you that almost every reasonably sized residency program has had at least one applicant who disqualifies themselves from getting ranked by acting in this very way. Now, the same principle is even more true if you're interacting with non-physicians in the program, because the number of applicants who manage to get themselves unranked by showing their butt when they're interacting with the program coordinator is sadly a number that's much greater than zero. And I can't say that I feel much sorry for them. If you're so self-absorbed that you can't navigate the straightforward task of conducting a polite email exchange with the program coordinator about scheduling your interview or the logistics of your interview day, well, honestly, I think you're going to have a pretty rough go of it in residency. Next piece of advice, don't walk into traps. Some trap questions are obvious. If you're applying to a prestigious big name program and someone asks you whether you're interested in research, then it really doesn't matter if you envision research being a major, minor, or non-existent part of your career. The correct answer to any question about research is that you are very, very interested in it. But I don't think that kind of trap question trips up that many applicants. Surprisingly, one that does is when someone asks about some obvious weakness on your application. Maybe you failed step 1, or you took a leave of absence, or you remediated a course, or you didn't get honors in the clerkship in the specialty that you're applying in. So certain interviewers will ask you to explain that. And the first thing you got to realize is this: whatever it is they're asking about, it's not a deal breaker. Remember, like I said at the beginning, no program is going to waste their own time by interviewing a person that they know on the front end they're not going to rank. And remember, too, they've had your application since September. So whatever it is you're being asked about, if it were that big of a deal, if it were a deal breaker, you wouldn't be there. So just be honest and be humble and take accountability and keep your composure, because 90% of the time, those are actually the dimensions that the person is trying to evaluate you on when they bring this kind of stuff up. Another kind of trap question that it doesn't come up as often as it used to in previous decades, but it still comes up occasionally in some highly competitive surgical specialties, is that you'll get an interviewer that starts to push you on some point. Maybe it starts with them asking you to tell them about an interesting case that you saw, or maybe they start asking you some questions about your research. But either way, they keep asking questions, and the questions just keep getting more pointed or even aggressive. And the goal here is they're trying to see how much of a BSer you are. Because like any parent of a 3-year-old knows, when someone keeps asking you why, you pretty quickly reach the limits of your knowledge, and you've either got to give an unsatisfying but honest answer like, well, I don't know, or you got to start making stuff up. If you find yourself in this situation, be honest. Next piece of advice, be graceful. There are some topics that are off limits for your residency interview because of NRMP rules or equal opportunity employment policies or general human decency. Interviewers are not supposed to ask you about what other programs you're considering, or whether you intend to get pregnant or have a baby during residency, or anything about your race or age or weight or health or sexual orientation or similar such topics. But in reality, many of you are going to get asked questions like these. And my best advice to you, again, assuming the context that you are primarily interested in maximizing your chance of being ranked to match at as many programs as possible, my advice for that scenario is that you should try to have some grace when this occurs. One reason I say that is because most of the time these questions come up, it's just because the faculty member is ignorant of NRMP policy, or they're socially awkward, or they're just trying to make conversation and they came of age in a different era. And I'm not saying any of this to defend them. I'm just saying that they weren't trying to be rude. So if you go and get upset and tell them that they asked an illegal question and you're not going to answer it, all you're going to do is chill the interview room and probably diminish their evaluation of you. On the other hand, some illegal questions really are signs or at least hint at major problems that might be looming for you, because you're going to have these people as your direct supervisors. And when you do, you're putting your career in their hands. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't consider the fact that you got asked illegal questions when you yourself are ranking programs. However, if your goal is to maximize the number of programs that are willing to rank you, then I still think you need to handle these gracefully. And there's no one-size-fits-all way to handle them. I mean, some things you might be able to deflect with humor. Well, my significant other is a resident, so I think we'll be far too tired to do what's necessary to have kids. Or sometimes you might want to just answer directly. Oh, I'm from California, but my parents are from Korea. Or maybe you could try to answer an illegal question in a way that shows a positive trait about you. I mean, am I going to rank your program number one? Well, I've loved everything that I've seen today so far, but I'm the kind of person that when I have an important decision to make, I always approach it thoughtfully and deliberately. And I also pride myself in honoring my word. And so for those reasons, I would have to tell you that I'm not yet certain how I'm going to rank any program at this point. Or maybe in some other cases, you address the spirit behind the question. So you say, look, I understand that residents in this program work a very demanding schedule, and despite my age or weight or sexual identity or whatever illegal thing you just asked me about, I can assure you that I'm up to the task and I'm eager to train here if you give me the opportunity. The bottom line is this: many of you are going to be asked illegal questions, and the spectrum of those questions is going to go from things that are harmless but annoying all the way up to some that are deeply offensive or even harassing. And when those come up, you've got to respond in a manner that's both appropriate and authentic for you in that situation. Once again, my advice is simply to choose the most graceful option from the subset of those appropriate and authentic responses. Next, don't bring up topics that you don't want to be explored. Because see, there's a caveat about some illegal questions. For instance, a program director can't ask you whether you want kids or intend to have kids, but if you bring up the fact that you have kids or want kids, then at that point it becomes fair game for them to ask questions about it and explore that topic further. So don't bring up protected topics like your age or your mental or physical health or sexual orientation or racial ancestry unless you really are fully comfortable discussing them, because once you open that door, you can't always easily retreat back to the protection of the topic being off limits. Next, don't bring your whole self to your interview. For one final time, let me remind you the context I'm assuming. If you are a strong applicant who's not worried about going unmatched and instead is primarily interested in maximizing goodness of fit with your program, then listen, it's a perfectly rational and calculated strategy to let the program know who you are. And if hearing that turns them off, then honestly, you might be glad that you found that out now instead of only after you got stuck with them for the next 3 to 7 years. However, if your goal is to maximize your opportunities to match, then you're best served by avoiding discussing or highlighting aspects of your personal background or opinions that might be very important to who you are, but are still not essential parts of your ability to function in the occupational role of a resident. Here, I think the old adage about avoiding religion and politics, it definitely applies. Your interview is not a good forum to talk about Trump or Biden or Harris. There is no upside. You're not going to change anybody's mind. And definitely do not say anything about Israel or Palestine. I probably should have included this when I talked about trap questions a few minutes ago, because sadly, I've heard of a few instances this year in which interviewers have tried to draw interviewees into conversation about October 7th or genocide or watermelon or anything else. Unsurprisingly, these questions were directed at applicants whose last name or demographics might have suggested that they might have relatives or at least ancestors who were on one side of that conflict or the other. I shouldn't have to say that you need to tread very carefully in these areas. And that's the case even if you think you're talking to someone whose opinions are similar to yours. Because honestly, you don't want them going back to the rank order list meeting in a few months and bragging to the other faculty about how they appreciated your courage in speaking out about whatever side of the Israel-Palestine conflict you spoke out on. If you do get asked a question like this, I think you got to think long and hard about whether this is really a program at which you could be safe and successful, given the point that I made earlier about how the faculty are going to have your career in their hands. However, in the moment, I think I would try to acknowledge that, of course, you have opinions, but you're a doctor. And when you're wearing the white coat, you do nothing but treat your colleagues and patients with dignity and compassion, regardless of where they're from or where they may stand on this issue. And now, one final piece of advice: write thank you notes. It's an old school thing to do, but I'd still say do it. Now, let me be clear about what I mean. I'm not saying you need to break out a quill pen and the old thick cardstock and write physical notes. An email is plenty. And again, I'm not saying you should write a lengthy note. A couple of lines should suffice. What I'm talking about is a quick email sent the day of your interview or the day after that says, "Hey, Dr. So-and-so, I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. I was very impressed with this aspect of your program, or excited about this one thing you told me about. Thank you for considering my application, and I wish you all the best for the future." Don't commit to any particular ranking of the program. Don't ask a question or even phrase things in a way that obliges the other person to respond. Just tip your hat, be on your way. If you do anything other than that, there's at least a small risk that doing this is going to hurt your chances, either because you're overbearing or because you seem ungrateful. But if you send a simple, short message, just as I've instructed, I really think there's no realistic downside. And somewhere out there could be edge cases where simply acting like a decent and courteous human being may tip things in your favor in terms of ranking. If you stuck with me this far, thanks for listening. I really hope some of this advice will be helpful, and I wish all of you the best of luck during your interview season.